Hey there, I'm John with EDMProd, and today we're going to jump into how to match your favorite artist's mixdown. Fundamentally, using references is the best way to get a mix that holds up in a DJ set or when tracks are just streamed back to back. If you mix your track to match an artist that works in a similar genre, or if the song just has a lot of the same sonic characteristics of the one you're working on, then your mix is going to hold up across streaming platforms, DJ sets, things like that. Step one is to find mix references. For me, I usually like to find 3 different tracks, preferably from 3 different artists. The reason why I do this is so I can get like a well-rounded perspective. I've got my 3 songs in here. Got an OK Jake and Stash tune, Torcha and Medicine Place, and a tune by Infree, I believe. And what I do is I make audio tracks and I load them into the actual Ableton project that I'm going to mix down, and then I put those 3 tracks into a group. This is an important thing to do based on the way that I like to set up my mix references. Once you have your tracks and your group, go ahead and turn them all off so that all the channels and the group are turned off. The next thing you'll want to do is to grab any device that has a sidechain input. I typically just use glue compressor for this, and I drag my glue compressor after my end stage limiter or clipper, but before any of the analysis tools that I use to check my mix with. Turn the dry wet down to 0%. You can turn soft clipping off, open the little panel to display the sidechain, turn sidechain on, and set the audio input to come from that group you created that has your reference tracks. For me, that's 78 group. Now the key here is to hit this little headphone button. What this button allows you to do is to listen using the glue compressor to whatever you have set as your sidechain input, in this case, the group. So now, if I play my track and I turn this glue compressor on and off, you'll hear it cut the audio out. The reason why it's cutting the audio is because none of these tracks are currently turned on. If I were to turn one of these on, now we'll have an immediate A-B back and forth reference between my track and the reference. So this right here is the most effective setup. I know there's plugins like Metric AB that allow you to do this. For me, this just works, keeps it all contained within Ableton devices. I don't have to worry about getting a third-party plugin or figuring out that. So now we have our mix reference system set up. One final thing I like to do is go up to the top, click the key mapping button, and then I map the on-off button of the glue compressor to a key on my keyboard. I just chose the little tilde key that's underneath the escape button. Now I can press this button on my keyboard and turn this on and off at will. This is pretty useful as it keeps you from continually having to go and turn this on manually when you're working on other tracks in the project. Now I'm going to dive into all the meters you might need in order to appropriately analyze these tracks. I'll come back to this one. I am going to show you how to build this. It's very important for stereo monitoring. But let's just go over here to the spectrum. I have 2 spectrums. One is set from a range of 0 decibels to about negative 79, 75, somewhere around there. I find that to be the most useful range. Anything below that is nearly inaudible anyway. And then I have this one set from 0 to negative 10. What that does is focus this spectrum in around the negative 6 point. For most EDM genres, the low end of the bass typically shows up somewhere within a few decibels of negative 6 on a fully mastered track. This is, of course, subject to change from genre to genre. Some genres push the sub a lot more, some genres much less. But generally, negative 6 is a good mark. Over here, I just have a utility with mono turned on, just so I can turn this on if I need to and check for mono compatibility. I have tonal balance control. This is not really necessary. You don't absolutely have to have this. I have span. Now, this is a free plugin from Voxengo, and it's a really excellent spectrum. I have mine configured in a certain way where it allows me to see the mid-band and the sideband simultaneously. So this green that we see here is the mid-band, and the kind of like orangey-ish color underneath that, that's the sideband. How you set this up is you go up to where this says routing and click the little drop-down right next to it, choose mid-side stereo. And then on this box that says underlay, you want to choose side. Now you're going to be able to see mid and side simultaneously. I have isotope insight here, which I mainly use for LUFS metering. You can also use Ulean loudness meter. That's a free plugin. And then at the end here is just mini meters, which I have there mostly as a fun little visual component. I don't really use it too much to do any actual mixing. So now that we're set up to reference appropriately, let's talk about what the main aspects of the mix that we're looking for and listening to here are. And I'm going to talk about this in the order that I approach it. So first of all, loudness. This system only works if you are matching your track's loudness to the reference tracks. For me, I use LUFS to meter this. If you don't match the volume of your track to the volume of the reference, then you're going to get a skewed perspective as to how that mix relates to yours. So I'm just going to go and open up Isotope Insight and start metering a few of these references to see what the LUFS level is on them. We got about -8 there, so a little bit of a quieter one. Hit about -5 there, so quite loud actually. At a minimum, mine has to be -8. I could go a little higher if I want. At that point, it's kind of my preference and my prerogative as to whether or not I do that. So let me go ahead and switch over to my track and play that and see what we're at. I'm at about -6 here, so I might go over to my master bus clipper and just turn the volume down by 1 decibel. I just want to take a moment to note here that when I do my mixdowns, I do a process called working in the red. What this means is that throughout the entire compositional and mixdown process, I'm pushing my track as loud as it would be if it was a mastered track. I find that this works for me. This works for a lot of EDM genres as well. And the reason why I feel this works better than mixing low and then boosting at the end is because as all of these tracks are combining through your limiter or clipper, they're going to start interacting. And if you're mixing at a low level, you could get some surprises as you turn it up into your limiter. You may feel like you have a nicely mixed track, but then as you turn it up, all these elements start interacting, creating new harmonics, combining together in unexpected ways. Doing it this way, I get no surprises. And then when it's time for mastering, I simply turn off my saturator, send it off to my mastering engineer, or if I decide to do my own mastering on that track, it's more or less done at that point. I could do some tweaks in front of this saturator, but it really streamlines the process for me. So I just wanted to mention that, given that this is not an unusual way to do things, but definitely a EDM-specific way to approach mixdowns. So going back here, I lowered my saturator input drive to 3 decibels, trying to aim for around -7 LUFS maybe. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. You know, it's right around 7. So now what I've done is I've kind of positioned myself in between. On the high end, I had -5. The low end, I had -8. I'm hitting around -6.5. That's pretty good. I think that's going to work. So we've got loudness taken care of. The next thing I think about is the overall mix contour. Whether the mix is brighter than my references, whether it's darker than my references. If your track is brighter or darker, you may want to take note of that, but not immediately make any changes. The reason why is that, let's say you have a track that feels really bright compared to your references. If you go and start turning the highs down before you check things like sub levels, you might find that, oh, it wasn't your track that was bright, but your track just didn't have enough of the low end in it to balance that top out. So while I do look at the overall contour, I usually don't make any knee-jerk reactions. Instead, take a look at a few other things first, like sub and kick. Span is a really excellent tool to use for checking this out. Of course, use your ears, but use the visual tools that we have as well. I'm going to go ahead and start with the references. And I'm kind of positioning this little crosshair here at the very top of the sub, and I'm just seeing what the difference between sub level and top level is. Now I'm going to switch over to my track and take a look. My track is a touch brighter than the reference, but not overly bad. Let's check out reference 2. On span, the sub-levels and the top levels are showing up as pretty much on an even plane, so this track's a little brighter than mine. Check out the Medicine Place one. So this track is darker as well, darker than mine is actually. This is a great moment to pause and address the second reference track. As I'm going through and checking, I'm kind of getting the idea that this second reference track might not be a very good reference for my song. It seems to be an outlier, at least in both the cases that I've looked at for it. It was much louder and it's much brighter than my song, and it's much louder and brighter than these two songs as well. It's important to recognize when you're using a mix reference that's not appropriate for your mix. I'm going to take a moment and swap this one out with something different. This is something that I find myself doing fairly often during mixdowns. All right, I've got my new track in here. I'm just going to roughly match drops. Let's see how this one works. As far as the overall contour of the mix goes, much closer to the other two and my own currently. Let's check out Isotope Insight. About -7, so very close to mine. Now that I have all three of these in here, I'm just going to lower the drive 1 more decibel, check mine. Oftentimes mixdowns are a lot of this back and forth. You don't want this. So there we go. Now I'm hitting somewhere directly in the middle of all three of these tracks. Let's check this second mix reference against my track now, as far as the overall contour goes. Pretty close. Overall, I'm not seeing a lot of huge issues. But like I said, just take note of this because the next thing we're going to check are sub-levels. This is where this 0 to 10 range spectrum really comes in handy. I'm going to go through and take a look at all of the sub-levels for the references and just kind of see where they're floating around here. This one's hitting around -5. This one's mostly hitting about a decibel underneath that, about -7. And again, this one's hitting right around that -6 point. So let me take a look at mine and see what we got. Just above -6. This is no surprise to me. As I am working on my track, I'm always balancing and always mixing. I don't save my mixing all entirely for the mixdown. But if I did see any issues, I would go up to my sub track, add an EQ with a low shelf, and start to play around with boosting by a decibel or two. So now mine's hitting the sub-levels of the first track we look at, a little higher than the other two though. So one of them was right at -6, one was a decibel above, one was a decibel below. Again, let's use the average. I'm going to get mine to situate just right at -6. What that probably means is taking it down by about half a decibel. And there we go. I've got my sub locked in. Now, if I had any choices to make about the high-low balance, this is where I could start to work with that. I do think that my top end is a little bit higher than the references. Yeah, I'm seeing a bit of a bump right here around 8 to 10K. Let's check the final reference. So what that's telling me is that I can now address what's causing that. And in this case, it's going to be those hi-hats. So I'm going to go up to where my hats are and just turn my cymbals down by a couple decibels. Let's just do 3 decibels here. When doing a mixdown, I definitely encourage everyone to, first of all, just try simple gain changes as opposed to reaching for tools like EQ, compression, things like that. Unless you know for a fact, hey, this thing needs compressed because it's too dynamic, or there's only one little frequency that's popping out. In this situation, I think I can achieve it by simply turning down the main cymbals group. Pretty even by now. I think that's looking really good. So after we've got the sub locked in, the next thing I take a look at is kick levels. I'm just going to use my ears for this, but then I will go over and take a look at some meters. My kick is quite a bit louder and maybe a bit brighter than this one as well. Tonally, fairly similar to this. I think that's locked in there. This is a really weird kick on this one. Honestly, sometimes you're just going to come across songs that use a strange sound that's very unusual. Part of the fun and charm of making music is you can do whatever you want with that. But I don't really think this is a good kick reference. That's okay. I don't got to ditch the whole reference. All I have to do is really pay attention to these two. So this one was pretty similar. This one was not quite as loud as mine. It was a much more minimal kick. So I'm just going to start with the S-Fam track and try to look in my spectrum here to see what level their kick's hitting at. All right, here's their kick. We can really see it poking up just a tiny bit here on the bottom of the spectrum. This is a really important thing to note too, is that for my genre that I work in, which is left field bass and dubstep, I know that my kick should probably be just barely peeking up over the bottom of this low-end monitoring spectrum, within a few decibels of that anyway. If I see my kick popping up much higher, then I know it's too loud. The reason why I know this is because I've just studied tons and tons of mixdowns. So I highly encourage you to get very familiar with whatever genre you're working in. If you're working in techno, your kick's going to be much higher. If you're working in something like lo-fi hip-hop, it's going to be much lower. I can see here this is sitting right around -10, -11 approximately, which for me, I fully expect that. Let me take a look and see what this one's at. This one's lower, right? It's at about -14. Now where is mine sitting? There it is. I can see it pop up right here. So mine's at about -9, which means that I have to turn my kick down by a couple decibels in order to match that reference. I'll turn it down here and take another listen. Let me just turn the bass off real quick. Looks like I'm hitting around -11.8, so maybe I only need to take it down by 1 decibel. Actually, that's kind of where it was to begin with, so I was probably just seeing the combination between the kick and the sub. Look at mine is peaking up onto the bottom of the spectrum just like the other track was, so I feel like my kick's in a good spot. I'm going to leave it and move on. After kick, I move on to snare. I'm really working here to begin with the backbone of the track, which would be sub, kick, snare. Once I get those 3 elements locked in, I can mix everything else around them. Once again, we're going to start with references. I'll go bottom to top this time. My snare seems to be a bit louder and a bit brighter than this reference. Definitely louder and brighter than this one. Definitely louder and brighter than this one. So I need to attenuate the high end of my snare a bit. Let's go up to my snare channel. And this is a situation where I would reach for something like an EQ to begin with, because I think it's really just the top end that needs a little bit of dampening. Let's grab a high shelf. Much closer. The goal here is not to necessarily get an identical sonic characteristic or identical sonic match between these tracks, but to bring them into a similar range. Listen to your own preferences to a certain point. I'm not saying like, okay, just mix however you want, because that will end up creating mixes that do not translate well or do not work well with other tracks. What I'm saying is, once you get your track or different parts of the track to a certain area where it's not wildly off base compared to the tracks you're referencing, at that point you can kind of start to have a little bit of an artistic approach to it, where you're like, okay, I know that my snare might be a little brighter than the references, but it's not that much brighter, and I like how it sounds. After we've dealt with the kick and the snare, I start to listen for clarity, primarily low-mid clarity and top-end clarity. Those are two areas where things can get very hazy. Now, low-mid is tricky. The low mids from around like 100 to 500 hertz, somewhere around in there, there's a lot of possibility of it being very muddy if you have too much going on down there, or if what you have is very unclear. Like if there are not clear harmonics coming from your sub and your basses, or if there's just a lot of like reverb, tail, maybe effects that are bleeding down there, things like that. But on the flip side, if you cut too much of that out, your track's going to sound hollow. So you want to strike a balance here. For myself, what I find tends to work really well is if you can see really nice clear harmonics up from your sub and your bass up into 200, 300, 400 hertz, somewhere around there. I'm going to take a look at these references and show you what I mean on span. Do you see this series of really, really nice clear harmonics? Now again, this is a little more genre specific in some ways, but I do think that these approaches can be applied to nearly any genre. Sometimes though, there are going to be genres that have a lot of a thicker mix down here. Let me take a look at the other references. A very low mid heavy track. We've got a big bulking here around 200 to 600 hertz. Look at these really nice clear harmonics up here. These are kind of part of the mid bass sound. I'm mostly looking at the first three. That'll be harmonics 1, 3, and 5 coming off of the sub, which is creating a nice warm saturated sine wave type sound. Let me take a look at my track and see what that low mid area looks like. It's not too bad, but it could use a little bit of work. Now, I don't know if I'm going to be able to achieve that without completely decimating the sonic characteristic of my sound. Before I do that, though, I just want to check out general levels between these different references. My low mids are pretty similar to the Medicine Place tune. They are much lower than the SFAM tune. And while this lower harmonic I'm seeing here matches the upper ones, it's not a whole lot going on there. But really that's part of the sound design of this particular song. I think what I can do now is just start to look through my individual bass sounds and see where I can kind of get a little more clarity. Let's solo the sub. Here's Here's where a bit of that mud is coming from. We see these unevenly placed harmonics. What that's being caused by is this overdrive. The overdrive is really boosting the fourth harmonic on this sub, and usually in most cases I like to keep just odd harmonics. But I don't really think that I can do much about that without changing the characteristic of this sub sound. I really like what the overdrive does to it. I'm not going to sweat it too much. Again, this is where the artistic intent comes in, the artistic choices. I wonder if there's anything else I can do to clean that low end up. I do have a nice series of clean harmonics here. They might be uneven in terms of their gain, their individual volumes, but it's not too bad if I combine these two together. I'm still seeing a bunch of really nice, solid, prominent harmonics down in the low end. I don't necessarily think that I have to go through and try to carve those out anymore. What you really want to watch out for is if you really can't discern any harmonics down here, and it looks just like a big bulking up mess of low frequency sound. So now that I think my low mids are where they want to be, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at top end clarity. Primarily listening for cymbals, making sure it's not washy, muddy, noisy up top there. I do find this track to have a lot more simplistic hats that are really nice and clear compared to mine. The hats are quite low in the mix on this one. I'm going to go up here and see if there's anything I can do to tighten these hats up and make them feel a little bit more locked in. I think one of the main contributors to this is this sound. It's got kind of like a sound, and when I really want more is like a tick, tick, tick. Hopefully that makes sense. My favorite way to get this to happen is to go to the warp modes and choose beats. I'll keep it set to preserve transients and then do forward and stop. And if I start dragging this number down, what it's going to do is shorten the tails a little bit based on where these transients are placed. Now, one of the things that I want to bring up about this sound is that I see there's a transient marker on this little one right here. I don't think I really want those little ones to be triggering this transient, so I can just hover over them and press delete. That way only the main hat sound is being affected. Now I'm going to go ahead and pull the transients down. Definitely a lot tighter. I lost a little gain though, so I'm going to turn that up. Cool, I think that did quite a bit. Yeah, that's great. Let's compare it to this one that I didn't change at all. Definitely a little looser. So now I do feel like this first part of it is matching the top end clarity that I'm hearing in the references. Much nicer. You want to make sure that your tops have a lot of definition to them, particularly if you work in genres like drum and bass, where the highs are so fast, it's easy to have the hats feel as though they're melting into each other and just creating more of like a in the top end rather than a something like that. The last thing I check in my mixdown is stereo width. Now this is where we get into the tool I told you at the beginning I'd tell you more about later. So what this basically is a mid-side encoder decoder. What that means is it splits the mid signal, which is everything in both speakers that are identical, from the side signal, which is everything in both speakers that are different. The way that I make this is by using a utility I right-click the width knob and set it to mid-side mode. If I turn this all the way to the side, we're going to get a very, very strange sounding signal because we're only listening to everything that's different in both speakers, which means these waveforms are going to be totally opposite, and it's kind of a disconcerting feeling to hear. My brain hates it. So the issue is that we have these two perfectly opposite signals causing this intense stereo width. What I can do is actually use another utility to flip the phase of either the left or the right side. So we've essentially taken two opposite signals, flipped one on its head, and therefore wound up with two identical signals, which will be interpreted as a mono signal in the middle. It's much easier on the ears, and also if you notice, Spectrum will not show only a sideband signal. Spectrum only allows you to see the mid signal, so setting it up this way allows us to use our meters as well. If you notice over here, I'm using only one utility to achieve this. The reason why is because it's an old one. That's why there's this upgrade here. I think at some point they changed the internal routing of this in an update, and now the new version doesn't let you do it, so you have to use two of them. I'm going to go ahead and group this. That way I can turn it on and off. So now I'm going to turn this on and off, and I'm going to listen to the references, and I want to take a look at what the contour of the sideband mix is in my Spectrum. What's the loudest thing we hear? That's the snare. What does that tell you about the snare? It tells you the snare is very wide. Because we're only listening to the stereo image right now, if you hear something louder than something else, that means it's not necessarily louder in the full stereo mix, it's more wide than other things in the stereo mix. Check it out, reference 2. Very, very wide lower mids. Extremely wide, actually. Unusually so. Now, when I'm looking for a stereo mix, this is usually what I'm looking for. A fairly flat response with a bit of a drop off in the top end. I would say out of all three of these tracks, this one has the most normal distribution of width. There is a lot of width in the sub. It's totally fine to have width in your sub as long as it's not too much and you're not getting phase cancellation, but a little bit is okay. And I like to add a little bit into most of my subs. But a lot of the time you'll also see the stereo width just stop right around 100 Hertz because people will sometimes put their sub in mono. So I'm actually going to use this one as my main stereo reference. Let's go ahead and switch back over to my track and take a look at what my sideband mix looks like. Generally, pretty much the same, except look, I don't have a wide sub. If I want to match this reference, I need to add some width into my subs. Let's go ahead and do that. The best tool for this is the iZotope Imager. There's both a paid version and a free version. Here's the free version. Here's the paid version. The difference is the paid version, you have 4 bands, so you can independently adjust stereo width for each of those individual 4 bands. But just to make this more accessible to everyone, I'm not going to use the paid version. I'm going to use this one. So how this works is you have to turn on Stereoize, and then you can turn up or down the width. Now this operates as sort of like a Haas effect in a way. This is the timing offset between the left and the right channel. The Haas effect uses a delay on one channel or the other to create the impression of stereo width. Now one issue here is that this is going to affect the whole sub bass, including the top harmonics on it, but I only want to affect the bottom fundamental frequency. It's a pretty easy thing to get around. I can just create a top-low split. So I'll grab an EQ, set it to a high pass at 100 Hertz, group that, duplicate the chain, and on the bottom chain, I will set this to a low pass. So now I have a top that's doing the highs and a bottom that's doing the lows. And I can just drag and drop this imager onto the lows. So top, low. There we go. So diving into the imager, my first step is to crank the width all the way up. I definitely don't want it there in the end stage, but what this allows me to do is to get the sub feeling centered and not skewed off to one side or the other. Do you see right here, the sub is kind of skewed a little bit off to the left-hand side. We can fix that by adjusting the timing offset. That's nice and centered. We're getting a pretty good, like almost cardioid type shape. And now what I want to do is adjust the mix width until I see the sub falling in line with the rest of the sideband mix of my track. That's pretty good. Doesn't take much. Usually I find that this lands between 4 to 7%, somewhere around there. Now we've got our sideband mix locked in. Now let's say there was something that was too wide. How would we deal with that? Like maybe that one little effect that's coming through that's going like, brrr, I think that might be too wide. What is it? Is it this? Yeah, it's this sound right here. So a lot of stereo width in this. My favorite way to deal with this is to use an EQ8, set the mode to M/S, which is mid-side mode, and now I can use this as basically a sideband attenuator. If I just drag this low shelf all the way to the top, so all I'm really doing is just pushing the sides down. You see, the lower I go, the less we're going to hear it. It's much more quiet. But I probably only want to bring it down by about 6 decibels or so. It really depends on how it sits in the rest of the mix. That's a lot better. I don't feel that popping out of the sideband mix that badly. Once I'm done with that, I turn off my opposite sideband solo, give the track one more listen against the references, try to pick up on anything that I might have missed before, really opening my ears, really just listening to the whole thing. And if it's good to go, it's good to go. And there you go. Now you know how to get your mix to match that of your favorite artists. If you find this useful and want to up your production game even more, head on over to EDMProd.com. Link is in the bio. We have a ton of free resources over here, like the EDM Starter Kit, which is a huge pack of over 700 samples, as well as a whole 50-plus page PDF on how to make electronic music. Lots of good information in there. Go check it out.